When you come into a paleo or grain-free style diet, all of the grain-free flours can be overwhelming. So today I want to talk about coconut flour. I wanted to start with coconut flour because it's probably like the most unlike wheat flour or any of the other flours that you've ever experienced. And it's the one I get the most questions about, especially about like substitutions. If you could substitute one for wheat flour, almond flour, cassava flour, all these other flours. And the short answer on that one is no. But let me get into exactly what coconut flour is, what it can be used for, what it's made of, all of those different things. So coconut flour is a naturally gluten and grain-free flour that's relatively high in protein and fiber, but also low in carbs. So it makes it great for a lot of diets in this regard. But what it exactly is happens to be the dried up ground pulp of like the meat of a coconut. And it's actually a natural byproduct from coconut milk. If you were to watch my coconut milk video, which I'll link to up here, you'll know that like I had that little pulp afterwards after I made the milk, and I made it into like a kind of cheese. But if you were to take that and then spread it thin on like a baking sheet or a dehydrator sheet, and then bake it or dehydrate it at a low temperature until completely dry, and then grind it all up, it would be coconut flour. That's essentially how they make it. Now, I find it a lot easier to buy it. That's just my personal preference, just because I don't really have time to do all of that all the time. But it is definitely an option for you. And because it is just dried up coconut meat, it is suitable for a ton of different diets. I mean, like the Paleo, Whole30, and AIP that I always typically talk about, but also for a ton of other ones that I don't typically talk about, like Keto and GAPS, SCD, vegan, everything. So the benefits of coconut flour, there's actually quite a few. And I would say it's like, if you are comparing against wheat flour doesn't have a ton of benefits, especially these days when you strip all away, like all of the benefits of the wheat germ and all these different things that are not necessarily bioavailable to us and cause issues. But like white flour is just kind of right? Where coconut flour actually has some benefits. It's high in manganese. It's also high in fiber. It rings in at a whopping 11 grams of fiber per ounce of coconut flour, which can be a blessing and a curse. It's inulin fiber, which is also a prebiotic. And if you're not familiar with prebiotic, it's the food that a probiotic eats, which when you eat a lot of it can cause gas, bloating, and gastrointestinal distress in some people. So I recommend, if you've never had coconut flour before, that you do start off with a small amount and see if you are affected, because it can cause issues in some people. If you are one of the affected people, you can either like not eat it at all or start off with a small amount and then gradually build up. A lot of times that's what you need to do if you have any sort of prebiotic, whether it's a vegetable or coconut flour. Having a whole ton at one time, it's going to cause a lot of gastrointestinal distress and issues. But if you build up, it's not so bad. The protein content of coconut flour comes in around 5.5 ounces per ounce of coconut flour, which is pretty high. And with that and the fiber, it can actually make you feel pretty full, which is a good thing because then you don't need as much of it. Like for example, if I ever make little pancakes, I'll make these little silver dollar kind of pancakes, and I can have like 2 of those and feel full. Whereas if I was to have some other kind of like pancake, like almond flour or something, I need some bigger ones to really feel satiated. It is a dense flour though. Again, this is a blessing and a curse though. It's a blessing in that you don't need to use as much of it. So you're saving money, you're not using as much of your resources. But if you don't get the liquid ratio, because it needs a lot of liquid, right, then it's gonna be very dry. Blech. Yeah, it's not very good when it's dry. It's also quite a bit more expensive than like wheat flour, for example. But then again, all of the grain-free flours are pretty expensive if you've looked comparatively. I mean, for example, a 4-pound bag of Anthony's coconut flour, which is the one I buy, on Amazon is like around $10.99 right now. And if you were to get a comparable bag of wheat flour, I think it's around like $3.99, or that's like a 5-pound bag. So, I mean, it is like 3 to 4 times more expensive. However, you only typically need like a 1/4 cup per 1 cup of wheat flour for things and recipes. So if you're comparing with wheat flour, it could kind of even out because you're not using as much. And you may notice in a lot of recipes, coconut flour often is only like 1 or 2 tablespoons or a 1/4 cup here or something like that. It's not a lot of times the entire recipe. And that's because through a lot of experimentation, a lot of us who have created recipes have found that the mixture of flours seems to work better, have a better texture, like gives a better result. So you only need a little bit for here and there, not a ton. So how do you use it? So because it is so different than wheat flour, and because it's a really, really thirsty kind of flour, you're going to approach it completely differently than wheat flour, or really any other kind of grain-free flour for that matter as well. You typically cannot, and I'm going to repeat, cannot substitute 1-for-1 coconut flour for wheat flour or any other grain-free flour. Now, I'll talk about the other grain-free flours in another video, but I just want you to know that coconut flour kind of stands on its own in the way that it acts. And I will have one exception that I will explain a little bit later. But typically, if you're looking at a recipe and you see something for like almond flour, for example, and you're like, well, I can't have almonds, can I replace it with coconut flour? No. The answer is no, you cannot do that. You have to do some ratios and putting in liquids and all this kind of stuff. So not a good idea to just try to replace it 1-for-1. If you're making baked goods, liquids are gonna be your friend. And typically the ratio is like 1 egg per 1 ounce of coconut flour. However, this can range quite a bit, and depending on the recipe that you're following, you may not even have any liquid or any eggs. Like my AIP lavender shortbread cookies, for example, have neither of these things, yet they're still delicious. You know, kind of go figure, right? I'm such a rebel. So because of this, I recommend that if you're new to paleo baking or any sort of grain-free baking, especially using coconut flour, that you use tried and true recipes at first till you really understand how it works before trying to come up with your own recipes or substituting coconut flour in for things in your favorite, like your grandmother's favorite recipe, for example. So some other notes for baking with coconut flour. You'll notice when you use coconut flour, it can be clumpy. So I do recommend that you either sift it with like a wire mesh sieve, or you can whisk it or break it up with your hands just to get rid of all those clumps, because if you're eating a finished coconut flour baked good, you don't want a clump of coconut flour in there because that is going to be dry and nasty. And then another note is when you actually mix the liquids into the coconut flour in like a batter, it's going to look really runny at first. But then as you let it sit there, it's going to soak up that liquid like a sponge, and then it's going to be looking kind of dry and like sticky. And when you go to actually scoop it out, you're going to need to have a spoon or some sort of device to like kind of get it out into like your muffin tin or on your cookie sheet or griddle or whatever. And you're not going to really be able to pour it out like you can with a lot of other batters. But this is also why you may see in recipes, a lot of times it says to let sit for 10 to 20 minutes, just so that the coconut flour can absorb all of the liquids. And if you remember, I said there was one exception for using coconut flour 1-for-1 in a substitution for other flours, whether it's wheat or other grain-free flours. And that's if you are coating like fish or chicken and then cooking it in a pan or an oven. For example, an easy dinner idea is to take a 1/2 cup of coconut flour, mix in some salt, some garlic powder, maybe some like Italian herbs, and so that's AIP, Paleo, and all Whole30 all at that time. And then if you are not on AIP, you can use a beaten egg, or if you're on AIP, you can use like a 1/2 cup of coconut milk, for example. Dredge 1 to 2 pounds of boneless, skinless chicken thighs or chicken breast in the egg or the milk, and then put it in the coconut flour mixture, and then put it into a hot pan that has avocado or coconut oil in it. Fry it, kind of like cook it on both sides until done, and done is like the instant read thermometer says 165 degrees Fahrenheit, and there you have an easy dinner, and it really tastes good. And then the question comes up of, where do I get this coconut flour? And honestly, these days, it's really easy to find it at most grocery stores I found. Typically it's in like the baking aisle. Sometimes you have to look in the alternative flour section where they have like the Bob's Red Mill flours or something like that. But I found that they're in most stores at least. If you can't find it there, or if you're like me, I just tend to get it on Amazon. I get the Anthony's brand because that's the one I've really liked. But there's so many different brands and different places that you can get it these days. So just do some research, experiment, see which ones you like, and just go with that. Like if you find one brand and a place that you like it, go with that. So I'll link to several recipes below on my website for some coconut flour recipes. Like I have my AIP lavender shortbread cookies, some paleo carrot cake pancakes, and some paleo roasted strawberry muffins. But let me know, like, do you use coconut flour in your cooking? And if so, what are some recipes that you like to use? Share with us so we can make them too and enjoy them. Also, let me know what flour you want to hear about next, because I haven't quite figured out which one I'm gonna do, so I'll take any suggestions. And also, if you haven't gotten the password already to my Paleo and AIP freebie library, where I have a ton of resources like recipes, meal plans, guidebooks, all kinds of stuff, I will put the link to how to get the password there below, and I will see you next week.